My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the latest event in our webinar series. Today's program is entitled North Korea, Next Steps for the Trump Administration, featuring Fred Fleitz and Claudia Rosett. Before we begin, just a couple housekeeping items. First of all, you are in listen-only mode, but you can interact by text. You can submit questions in the Q&A box. You'll find it on the GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the program. We will be recording this event. Afterwards, it will be archived on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as on our website, securefreedom.org. I'll now hand it over to our President and CEO, Fred Fleitz.
Thank you, Adam. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in to this latest Center for Security Policy lockdown webinar. We've been doing these every Wednesday at 1 p.m. on a variety of crucial national security issues. We're planning one next week at 1 p.m. that our founder and executive chairman, Frank Gaffney, will be chairing on the threat from China. We hope to have a special guest. There's a possibility we'll change the time, so stay tuned on that, but I know it's going to be a good program. So our program today is with an extraordinary national security expert and a good friend of mine, Claudia Rosett. Claudia is a foreign policy fellow with the Independent Women's Forum and an award-winning journalist who has reported over the past 37 years from Asia, the former Soviet Union, Latin America, and the Middle East. She also is a former Wall Street Journal staff writer. She blogs at the Rosett Report at PJ Media, but I'm sure you know Claudia because she appears frequently on cable news, especially on the Fox News channel. So Claudia, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Fred, and hello, everybody.
So we're going to be talking today about North Korea, next steps for the Trump administration. Now, everybody knows we have an unconventional president, and his approach to North Korea has been quite unconventional. He had a policy in 2017 called maximum pressure to pressure China and other nations to abide by UN sanctions in North Korea and to get the North Koreans to stop their missile and nuclear program. And many people think that that program has had some measure of success, but there's some debate about that. The president agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un 3 times in Vietnam, the Vietnam summit, which was in 2019, in 2018, the Singapore summit. He also met at the DMZ with Kim Jong-un in June of 2019. So this is certainly the mark of a very different approach to North Korea. But I wanted to start off, Claudia, to discuss this bizarre situation of people thinking that Kim Jong-un was dead. And that's actually why we scheduled this, because when we scheduled the panel, we thought we might be talking about Kim's successor. And it turns out he was absent for 22 days and he wasn't dead. And I'm just wondering, just to start off the discussion, what do you think about that? And what do we learn from that situation?
Well, there are entire schools of thought devoted to the study of whether or not that was actually double who emerged. But is he dead? We don't know. We think he's not. But the answer is, at least for public purposes, we know really pretty little about what's going on. It was very unclear. Was he in quarantine? Was he dead? Everybody got very excited. The newspapers were full of articles about likely successors and how it would work. And then out he waddled again. And this has happened before. It happened in 2014. And part of what it tells us is we are not actually brilliantly sourced inside North Korea, as far as I'm aware. We just didn't know.
So the stories were maybe he had a heart operation, and there have been reports that this is a young man in his 30s who wheezes as he speaks. I mean, people who went to the Singapore summit told me that. And his father was overweight, diabetic, drank and smoked too much. The younger Kim supposedly drinks too much. But on the other hand, he may have been hiding from coronavirus in North Korea. So do you think he might have been hiding from coronavirus?
Yeah, well, this opens up a whole realm of, interesting speculation, and we must engage in that. And again, I pray that our intelligence services have better sources than I do, but I'm not confident of that. And yeah, I actually sat there as the coronavirus speculation went on, and sort of ran through the math on who's safe and debated whether to write something, and perhaps was saved by the fact that I had other things to do at the time, but debated whether writing something pointing out that there was this sort of celebrity effect with coronavirus. It tended to reach first the jet set, the people who were most in the international stream. And if you try and think through how Kim Jong-un lives, I don't think he's done his own laundry. Somebody's got to be there in attendance. And you start sort of doing the arithmetic. People prepare food, unless he's doing what some of us are doing, cutting his own hair and cooking his own dinner. He's got to be surrounded by people where even if you make a quarantine cordon, at some point they have to interface with the rest of the world. And that led on to questions. If we're all in this interesting realm of, well, how much did he actually know about how this behaved? Had China filled him in that it could be asymptomatically transmitted? Was he listening to WHO briefings? God help him. What were they? I've been doing that. What actually would he be exposed to? And it did seem to me that while ordinary people in North Korea have been consigned to death over and over if something unfortunate happens, food runs out, as happened in the mid-90s, or under the Kim regime, which goes back to the end of World War II, Stalin, thank you, that Kim Jong-un would actually be for all his quarantine efforts, would be sort of in the line of some major vectors because he lives a jet set celebrity life in North Korea. Okay, we don't know why he disappeared. We still don't know. We don't know how much he was propped up when he emerged. We're told he personally was, just before that, he personally was supervising missile launches. He was riding around on a white horse before that. We don't know a lot of things about what's real. The things we do know are when they launch a missile, we can look at the missile. We know things that we can observe sort of with our own eyes, if you like. A lot of the rest is extrapolation. And
I guess I should add, you don't agree with the North Korean government's official position that they have 0 cases of coronavirus.
I listened in wonder to them saying that at the World Health Assembly last week, which had a virtual meeting on Zoom, and the North Korean envoy repeated that they had not a single case. Congratulations to them and to the People's Liberation of Army in China, which apparently also has none. The miracles of East Asia continue. But of course we don't believe that. This is 5 million cases confirmed in 188 countries and territories. North Korea has to have some interface with the rest of the world, with China, which is having big problems right now sort of up near the Russian border. In other words, precisely the area where North Koreans who go back and forth would have to deal. And for
let me add one thought to that, then I have another question for you. Just today, the British government announced that the North Korean government will allow their diplomats to leave the country. They locked down the borders and would not let they would not let private planes in to let the diplomats out because there was a quarantine even on the embassies. But let me jump to something else. And this is something that you wrote that I thought was fascinating. After it looked like Kim may have died, there was a lot of speculation on who his successor might be. And one of those was Kim Yo Jong, his sister, who you referred to in an op-ed as Twisted Sister. So tell us, why would you call Kim's sister Twisted Sister?
Because she's a very big wheel in the propaganda and agitation department, as it's called. Here, I must give credit to Bob Collins, who has done amazing research on the actual hierarchies inside North Korea and how they function. And if you read some of the excellent reports that the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea has put out, especially his research into this, because he doesn't sort of talk broadly, he really digs into how this works. She was very important in the propaganda and agitation department, probably still is, if not the person basically overseeing it. What is that? That's not just propaganda like, Coca-Cola advertising. That is the place that shapes what all North Koreans are required to pretend they believe. Okay, that tells them what the fictions are of the day. Odd example, but it came up recently, and it's just sort of one of those North Korean things that's sort of enticingly weird, We don't really understand it, and yet, it's, for instance, recently the official press in North Korea informed their faithful readers that Kim Jong-un is not, contrary to, I guess, previous discussion, Kim Jong-un is not actually able to magically fold time and space. Now, how do you read that? I mean, one way I would guess, but it's a guess, is that they have a real problem with coronavirus inside North Korea, and they don't have a cure. They don't have anything they can really do. We don't know, but we know what it's like when it spreads into a place and accelerates with good medical care. North Korea has none of that. They have good care.
So the sister, Kim Yo Jong, is supposed to be her brother's closest confidant. And when Kim Jong-un flew to the Singapore summit, the two of them went together, but they flew in separate planes. Many people said this indicates that she is the leading contender to succeed him if he was to pass away. Others have said that because of the Confucius system of North Korea, they would not allow a woman to take control of the country, and maybe the best she could do would be a regent until one of his children reaches adulthood. Do you think that the sister could possibly succeed him?
Yes, I do. I mean, look, a little more on her. And this has been one of these things where Western coverage has been very bizarre over time. Remember, she sort of had her big debut on the world stage with the Olympics in South Korea. Kim Jong-un had his ICBM launches and his nuclear test on President Trump's watch, and then gave a speech saying we must have nuclear weapons, and then came the Olympics in South Korea, and North Korea allowed us how they'd like to send a delegation, and down comes the sister. And there was a meeting in the Blue House in Seoul, and she was covered in the Western press, sort of like Asma al-Assad was in Syria just before the uprising there. The fashion, the understated grace, the willowy, winsome ways. No, this is a monster. I'm sorry to say that, but she has risen. She's very high and apparently very trusted in one of the world's most monstrous regimes. She's at her brother's side constantly. And while North Korea might not wish to have a woman take charge, they're in, I think, a difficult spot right now. I mean, if our economy is hurting, the rackets right now that North Korea depends on are not doing well. Even Mexican drug cartels are having trouble at the moment. North Korea depends on weapons sales to the Middle East, particularly Iran. Iran right now is struggling with rock bottom, with oil. Nobody wants to buy oil. They're giving it away. Horrible oil market. They don't have money. And the sanctions, while I don't think sanctions are the answer. I think they can do a certain amount of useful damage, but there are more sanctions than there used to be. North Korea was getting around that by smuggling with China. China right now is kind of leery of people coming in, and I'm sure they don't want a reflux of coronavirus from North Korea, which has it, I'm sure. So there's the sister. Who do you turn to? You need somebody who knows how to run the place, and she might be interim, but I wouldn't rule out that she would take charge. I think we truly don't know. And if there is a plan for this inside North Korea, the signs we've seen suggest it would go to her. But
I think that's right. And let me add that when there were, dozens of experts speculating that if Kim Jong-un died, there would be a leadership struggle. There'd be a fight between the Kim family and the military. I didn't read it that way. I think Kim has been systematically killing off military officers and senior government officials. So if something happens to him, his chosen successor will take power. I think succession has always been a priority of the Kim family. Is that the way you see it?
Yes, very much. Look, it has to stay in the family. This is a totalitarian dynasty, quite an invention in modern times, but they've managed to hold on since the 40s. And if you look at who has been with him, who represented him at critical moments, that's the consistent theme. Now, he does have a history of executing his uncle-in-law and assassinating, remember the chemical weapons attack? It's a colorful family, assassinating his half brother in a Malaysian airport. But the sister appears to surf that pretty well. They went to school together as kids in Switzerland. They have a long history. And it is possible that in some ways, again, I guess here, that for him, there's always the King Lear problem when you arrange succession, which is you hand over a little too much power to the next guy and you could end up gone sooner than you want to be. In this case, it might be useful that she's a woman. She can sort of be there at his side. But let me just make a huge caution. Should it come to that, if Kim Jong-un in one of these duck dives doesn't come back up for air, and she does take power, we should not at all assume that this now means, oh, good, North Korea now has a nice woman in charge. She looks good in an expensive raincoat and she smiles. It'll be fine. No, it's more of the same monstrous family.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to jump to the Trump administration's approach to North Korea, which I said earlier has been quite unconventional. Now, one of the things that the president is most proud of is his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, which he thinks has helped lower tension substantially on the Korean Peninsula and opened the door to an agreement, and a door which the North Koreans have not walked through. Now, the president's decision to meet with Kim was very controversial. There's still a lot of people who disagree with it, and I'm just wondering where you come down on this.
Look, viscerally, I didn't like it. I think that this is one of the most monstrous regime on the planet. And I say that with no great affection for the regime in China or Iran or Syria, but Trump faced the intractable problem of what do you do? And that is where does this all go? That's been the problem for decades. And unless you're willing to go to war, and it may come to that before it's over, okay? What do you do? This is not a regime that just sits there in North Korea and, quietly kills its own people. It does that, but it exports weapons. It has pursued a nuclear program that has been incredibly dangerous. I think not just directly, but as sort of China's stalking horse. The people in Beijing, they watch what North Korea gets away with. And it's got to be the case that they think, gosh, if, crummy old North Korea can do it, think what we can do. And I think we're seeing that philosophy right now. So when President Trump began this personal diplomacy, I'm glad that it actually didn't come to some big deal, that it never really quite reached fruition for all that they signed a deal in Singapore, because I'm sure that North Korea would have cheated and cashed in on it. I think it was possibly useful in the sense that it took North Korea by surprise. They weren't I don't think they were expecting that this would happen. It took them a while to sort of regroup and think, what do we do? But I never thought it was going to succeed. I thought it was buying time, probably on both sides. And for President Trump, it seems to have done that in the sense that North Korea was really popping off nuclear tests. Remember, there were two in President Obama's final year, 2016, and then another when Trump came in. One of the first things he faced was this trio of ICBM tests that worked. The threats against Guam, they were threatening all over the place. It was suddenly this crisis in the middle of 2017, and then a nuclear test. So what to do? He wanted to stop that, and it did quiet down for quite some time. I don't rule out that it resumes now. Was this a success at stopping North Korea? No. But it's with North Korea, when you ask where do we go, it's a matter of looking for, I think, for any way to undermine that regime. Now, Trump legitimized Kim Jong-un by meeting with him. That's what I didn't like. At the same time, he did not accompany that, as far as I'm aware, by the usual largesse. And Kim has reaped great economic benefits in previous deals or attempted deals. That's the North Korean nuclear shakedown. And that didn't happen.
Well, let me follow up on the fact that we didn't give them largesse. Now, there was a summit in Vietnam that was supposed to resolve the deadlock between the US and North Korea during the nuclear talks. And it ended suddenly with President Trump walking away. What happened at that summit?
North Korea was supposed to basically agree that it would really denuclearize and show that it was doing that. And nothing of the kind was really forthcoming. And they just couldn't get to some point where, okay, this can really all go forward. And I never thought it would. You know, it was a question of how long the question let's go back to the beginning, because this is what fundamentally happened at the summit. And it was the same as what's happened with every attempt to deal with North Korea, is there are fictions that America has to subscribe to go into these, that North Korea will agree, that they will comply. And we talk on that basis and have concluded deals, giving them quite generous things on that basis in times gone by. It inevitably breaks down. As soon as any terms are reached, North Korea begins renegotiating the terms. And the question there is, how far can they push the people on the other side of the table? The US, the six-party talks, four-party, two-party, the agreed framework, everything. Always the pattern is they default to reneging as they sign the deal. And one of the most amazing examples was in 2007, the nuclear freeze, where Chris Hill negotiated that under President Bush, where as North Korea was agreeing that they would freeze their nuclear program, they were building a nuclear reactor in Syria. That those things overlapped. The Israelis bombed that in September. The deal was struck much earlier in that same year. So there was a period where the North Koreans were saying, Chris Hill was in Beijing saying, the North Koreans are agreeing and complying, and we'll give them $25 million to go along with this. And meantime, the North Koreans were building a reactor that had no visible purpose except nuclear fuel. So what happened really at the Vietnam summit? I think President Trump looked at this and said, fiction has gone far enough, I'm leaving. And Fred, there's something I've wondered about, a question, and if anybody has an answer to this, I'd love to know. And that is, did President Trump, along with the public bear hugs and glad handing and, thanks for the beautiful letter and all that stuff, was there a certain mafia cast to that discussion? I wondered, did possibly Secretary of State Pompeo and President Trump not just say nice things to Chairman Kim, as they began calling him, but threaten him privately? Because that, to me, would be the art of the deal. What should have been conveyed to Kim Jong-un, if you had any hope of getting anywhere, was a threat so terrible that he would want to come to the table. I have no idea if they did that, but that's what should have been the subscript. And I had some small hope of that. When, if you'll remember the summit, the Singapore summit, President Trump gave Kim an iPad with this sort of strange video produced by the White House or the National Security Council, showing all the glories that awaited if Kim Jong-un would just reform his economy and come our way. And then, okay, fine, whatever. I don't think he's going to do that, but because I think they would kill him if he did. They'd string him up in the public square. He probably knows that. But it's the only way he can peacefully get out of this, but he probably doesn't survive it, but which would be such a pity. But in the middle of that iPad video was a scene of a carrier group, US aircraft carriers, 3 of them, operating on exercises together in the Western Pacific. Actually, I think they were closer than that, basically near North Korea. Well, that's an unusual formation. You don't see 3 aircraft carriers operating together much. And then it showed Hornets taking off from the deck. Okay, that was a message to Kim Jong-un, I think. And it's possible that one of the problems that the US government has had for some time in trying to get that kind of message to North Korea is that it's not easy to get a direct audience with Kim, okay? You're talking with envoys who are going to be afraid to present everything. So if you want to really present a threat, you do it directly. And honestly, the kind of threat I hope they presented was, here are the targeting coordinates for where you use your bathroom every morning, where you take your shower, where you have lovely ladies rub you off or whatever he does, scrub you up, but where that they would have said, we could take you out anytime, which perhaps goes back, if I could just connect this to the question of what happened to him when he disappeared. If I could just share with you an interesting thought somebody mentioned to me. Why did Kim Jong-un drop out of sight? Was it only coronavirus? Well, look to the Middle East for a minute. Remember, very early this year, the US assassinated the head of the IRGC thug, Soleimani, who has been responsible for an incredible numbers of deaths and terrorism, and they basically blew him up with a missile, with a strike from the sky. Okay, what I was told was it's quite possible that Kim Jong-un took note of that more than most of us would, and wishes to avoid a similar fate. So, what did they actually do behind the scenes? I don't know. What precisely happened at that summit? It broke down as we all expected it would. Did anyone really think this was all going to happen? And at the same time, what Trump achieved politically is he has had, say, two and a half years now with no more North Korean nuclear tests. Maybe they completed all they wanted to do. Maybe they'll touch one off soon. I wouldn't rule that out. But that's what the summit got him. And North Korea is not the front burner issue of the hour. It sort of receded, even though it's dangerous.
Well, you made an interesting comment about Ambassador Christopher Hill. At the end of the George W. Bush administration, he and Condoleezza Rice worked very hard on a legacy deal for President Bush. And it was a disaster. It was a sellout. We took them off the state-sponsored terrorism list. We gave them other concessions. And right after we agreed to everything, the North Koreans stabbed the Bush administration in the back, announced that it was increasing its production of plutonium. And I know for a fact that President Trump's been told about this. He's been told about the sellout to the North Koreans by the Clinton administration in the agreed framework, which is why President Trump and Secretary Pompeo have been adamant that we're not going to give away the store for an agreement with North Korea. And I think the talks have been stalled because the North Koreans are waiting for their payout. They're waiting for us to buy them off. And I actually think that's why the Vietnam summit failed. But still, I think there's something to this personal diplomacy. I've seen many of the letters exchanged between the president and Kim when I was NSC executive secretary, and I met with the president last August. He said to his secretary, "Bring me the letters." And the secretary came in with his envelope full of letters, and the letters from the president were handwritten, and the letters from Kim were typed in Korean with an English translation. They looked like letters exchanged between two friendly world leaders. And I mean, I understand that it's in a way incomprehensible that an American president would seek a relationship like that with a bloodthirsty killer. But on the other hand, this is a nation that detonated a nuclear weapon in September 2017 that may have had a yield of 250 kilotons. Now, bear in mind that Hiroshima was 15 kilotons and Nagasaki was 21. I mean, this was a huge weapon. And I think the fact there hasn't been a nuclear test since September 2017 is a small accomplishment. But we know that last year, I think because the North Koreans were frustrated that there had not been progress in the talks, that is, they didn't get their payoff, they resumed missile tests. They were short-range tests fired into the Sea of Japan. The Japanese were very upset about that. So I just want to put it to you, where are we right now? And where do you think the president should go next in pressuring North Korea to come up with an agreement, assuming that's even possible?
He should probably continue in these letters, if this correspondence is still going on, the enticement to reform and come our way while offering nothing. Because you could be right, that there's some value to that kind of exchange, to some kind of contact. I would be leery of reading too much into what that might do, because remember, you're dealing with someone who didn't hesitate to have Uncle offed when he was in the way, or get rid of his, assassinate his half brother with VX, or he comes from a family where you starve them to death if they become inconvenient. At the same time, he leads a strange and probably somewhat lonely life, consorting with Dennis Rodman when he can, but currently in quarantine for his own good, probably. So I would imagine letters from the American president are fun for him to get. And also it makes him very important. You know, America is still the superpower for all China's braggadocio. And um, the thing that's probably lies ahead, I fear, is this. North Korea needs resources. What you just pointed to, and I think you're exactly right. They were expecting the payola, didn't come. So they had no place else to go. President Trump wasn't going to give him the fat prize he was expecting. And which he was expecting because that's traditionally been the way the US has behaved. Here, take the money. You're going right back to Chris Hill, especially going to Beijing to find a way, enlisting the Federal Reserve to help transfer 25 million back to Kim Jong-un's daddy in 2007. So they would go forward with the deal. But North Korea is almost certainly very strapped right now, as I was mentioning before. And there are two paths they can basically take. One is reform, open up, you know, live the life on the iPad minus the aircraft carrier attack. And again, that probably will take the collapse of regime. I don't think that Kim Jong-un is going to do a Deng Xiaoping. Even Deng Xiaoping, of course, brought us Tiananmen. But the other way is you double down on what you know. And that is you get back to arms sales. I mean, one thing about their missile tests is they double as advertising. That's saying to the world, hey, look what you can buy from us. And remember, North Korea was building that clandestine reactor. You know, who knew it? We didn't know about it until the Israelis said, hey, there's this thing going on. Or maybe we told the Israelis, I don't know. I don't know who first spotted it, but construction was well underway before the Israelis finally blew it up. And more time went by before the American public was told what that thing was. It wasn't till April of 2008, 7 months later. So I think North Korea is capable of all sorts of underhanded things. Right now, all the attention is on China, the coronavirus, our election, and everything else. This is a moment when Kim Jong-un would want to be selling weapons. And remember, he mentioned recently that he wants to, it's time to expand on their great nuclear arsenal. I take that seriously. He's going to be looking for ways to make money, and they make money by selling arms and conducting rackets. So I expect more of that.
I'm going to pause after this next question. Well, not pause, but I want to invite the audience to text us questions about the subject. But we can't conclude this discussion without a discussion of human rights. I know that is a big concern of yours. And I mean, in terms of abysmal, is an underestimate. It really underestimates how bad the situation is in North Korea. What should the U.S. do about the North Korea human rights catastrophe?
Well, actually, the bottom line answer is bring down the regime, which is difficult. That's what we've been talking about. What do you do? Over and over. It's sort of writ small. The problem that Reagan had with the Soviet Union, well, no, it's not quite. The problem is, how do you bring down a regime like that without getting into a hot war? And as I said, that may happen before it's done, although we're now operating in a context of China, Russia, all these other factors that come into it. And I don't think we're likely to wean North Korea away from that. You know, China is too close, too powerful, too important in their calculus. So what do you do about the human rights in the meantime, which are an essential part of how that regime keeps power? That people are not allowed to think. They do think, but if they show signs of thinking for themselves, they're dead. They're sent to gulags, basically, to Kwanli-So, to these horrible prison camps. That has not gone away. And you might remember in 2014, to great fanfare, the UN Human Rights Council, for once in its existence, produced a useful thing, this long report on human rights violations in North Korea. And the US began trying to do something. Everybody was saying, great, you know, now this will fix something. It didn't actually fix anything. It informed us better. It took years of research that had been done by NGOs, by the private sector, and finally put it in some form with a UN stamp and showed, here's how awful it is. But it got nowhere. the Security Council would debate it at the UN, but because Russia and China have vetoes there, it wouldn't get anywhere. They just decide to talk again next year. It's now kind of gathering dust as an interesting document, but it hasn't propelled anything. So all that said, I'm going to say to you the recipe that perhaps we have to just steer by, even though it appears not to have done much, and that is keep exposing it. Right now, nobody's paying attention to human rights violations in North Korea. Okay, we're all busy with all these other things. They haven't stopped. And, you know, I was thinking about it, we have not seen the spate of Americans and Western visitors grabbed and held effectively hostage recently. I mean, maybe this will flare up again, or there are things we'll learn about that we didn't know because we're all looking elsewhere. But the case of Otto Warmbier was so awful, just so terrible. The young American student who went there was arrested, put on this monstrous show trial, forced into this very weird confession. They clearly wrote for him, and then disappeared to be reduced to a vegetative state and returned the following year to die in America. I mean, after President Trump took office. So there's no great answer except work in every possible way. It's sort of maneuvering around it's like defusing an unexploded bomb, okay? How do you finally defuse North Korea? That regime must go. There's no other way, I think. It's not gonna just reform. It can't. And human rights, same thing. Expose it, put out there anything that we do know. And folks, even when you're busy with all the rest of it, pay some attention to that and urge the administration to pay attention to that. It's the more one exposes, the better the chance that something happens.
There's an issue. There's an issue in this area that's very important to our close ally, Japan. The story of Japanese abductees, Japanese citizens who were kidnapped from Japan, including a young girl who was kidnapped off a beach in Japan, taken back to Japan to marry intelligence officers and use her to train them in the Japanese language so they could later infiltrate Japan. This is a big deal to our friends in Japan. And I was very happy when President Trump was the first president to speak out about this issue. And he spoke out about it in Japan and at the United Nations. It's not the only issue we have with the North Koreans, but I think we need to raise issues like this to say to our friends and allies that we get it and we care about their concerns. I don't know how this will be resolved either, but I was very happy that that was raised. So I'm going to move on. No, you go ahead, then I'll ask you a question.
Well, just quickly, I would credit President Trump that when he first came in, he gave a stellar speech in Seoul about the character of the North Korean regime. I have never heard an American president lay it out like that. It was, I mean, go back and read it. It was great. And that's, I mean, they should just reprint that. It would be fine. He gave another talk at the UN where I thought calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man was inspired. As the whole UN reeled in shock, how could you be so rude? Ridiculing tyrants is a very good thing to do, especially when you're very powerful. And as Trump did point out, his button really works. We know that. I think we know that. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I like the speech that President Trump gave before the South Korean parliament also, because it didn't simply call out the North Koreans for what they were doing, but I think he put the Moon government on notice to stop being so wishy-washy and to stand up to Kim and not to just give them anything for an agreement. Well, I want to ask our first question, and that is, what do you think the chance is that the North Korean government could give or sell a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group?
Unfortunately, I think it's reasonably high. I mean, you know, there are such factors as well. If they got caught doing that, what would we do? This is over and over, Fred, a game of chicken. And we've worried about it for a long time. You get to the point where you sort of worry about something often enough and you think, oh, well, it hasn't happened in 30 years, so it's not going to happen. And then it happens. So I wouldn't rule it out. What it partly depends on the behavior of the US government in the sense of a country like North Korea will observe how we react to things that are clearly devastating, right? And yet very difficult to address. Take the coronavirus, where everybody has now been observing sort of our wonderful democratic system, which is incredibly powerful and marvelous. You know, it's what I want to live under. And at the same time, we don't turn on a dime and just say, here, we're going to go carry out a nuclear strike here or there. We debate, we discuss. We have to sort of get ourselves aligned because we are a free society. Well, that's something that a country like North Korea would try to take advantage of. The unfortunate precedent is that is precisely something like that Syrian nuclear reactor, where they paid no real penalty. So I think they would have to do it carefully. You know, you don't want to get caught in the middle of that, but it's a distinct danger. Until that regime is gone, I would worry about it. And yeah, don't take the fact that it hasn't happened yet as insurance that it won't.
I have another question, but I just want to remind our audience, you can text us questions through GoToWebinar. And if you're having trouble doing that, you can email me a question at fleitz@securefreedom.org. That's Fleitz. I have my phone here, and I'll read your question to Claudia. My next question concerns the relationship between China and the United States concerning North Korea. Now, some people think that President Trump may have outmaneuvered the Chinese with the Singapore summit. After all, China wasn't invited. But it appears that since that summit, President Xi may have regained the initiative. What's your view on this?
Okay, I'm going to dissent from most of the usual wisdom. I have never thought that China was sort of out of the picture with North Korea. I think they play us on that front. I was delighted that China wasn't at the summit, although of course Kim flew to it in a Chinese airliner. So China was helpful. But we've been told for years that I was going through some of the headlines from 2006, and over and over we have read that China and North Korea are on the outs. And I don't doubt that, like China and Russia and all sorts of other complicated parts of this puzzle, they have things they don't like about each other. I'm sure of that. But I think China has made use of North Korea for a long time. And China does control that crucial border where North Korea brings things in. China, if it wants to, controls that area where North Korean shipping carries on all its rackets between North Korea and Chinese port of Dalian. Okay, and if you look back over and over, you'll read that, U.S. must look to China. China is the key. When has China ever, if this is the question I would ask, ever actually helped us deal with North Korea? We were told that they were really enforcing sanctions 2 years ago, right? That was going to end. That was part of the whole deal. Oh, good, under maximum pressure. Now China is finally going along with it. And then it turned out for the 40,000th zillionth time, oh no, they actually weren't. In the latest report from the UN panel of experts on North Korea sanctions, it's full of discussion of shipping traffic, smuggling goods in and out of North Korea, which is, by the way, how the weapons go out. And well, some go by air, and how all sorts of things from Kim's cognac to missile components come in. So if you sort of just parse through, may I home in on one thing where China was sort of got a central role. The six-party talks were hosted by China. Okay.
Yes.
And everybody was saying, wow, China is really going to help this. No, they were a disaster. I mean, they led to that 2007 deal we were just talking about, which while North Korea was building the Syrian reactor, while Chris Hill was urging that money be sent back to dirty money be sent back to Kim Jong-un with the help of the Federal Reserve through the Bank of China. And China does well out of this. Effectively, they put themselves in the position of broker. And one reason I would not be surprised to see North Korea touch off another nuclear test. I mean, they kind of made a mess of their favorite testing site, but I assume they could create another one. They tunnel well. It would not surprise me to see another nuclear test sometime soon, because what has usually happened is North Korea does something like that, ballistic missile test, nuclear test, and America goes running to China to say, help us contain this. And China says, oh yes, of course we will help and contain North Korea. And all these stories come out that there's hostility there, and it never happens. It just doesn't. If you go to that border between China and North Korea, China allows this stuff to go in. Can I just add one more thing there? Remember, it was a Chinese equipment company that sold them the enormous vehicles that they truck around those missiles on, the transporter erector launchers, the TELs. And China said, oops, we didn't mean to sell them to North Korea. That was a mistake. We thought they wanted them for forestry purposes. Right.
Okay. I got a bunch of questions, so I want to move on. This one is from Wayne Bowles in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and he'd like to know whether it would ever be possible for the U.S. to lead an international alliance of nations to force the removal of Kim and his family and work with South Korea for a peaceful reunification of the peninsula.
Oh boy. Well, it would be really hard to do that without getting a war, without doing it by way of a war. It's the part of the problem is the current government in South Korea is very pro-North Korean. I mean, they're having enormous conflicts in South Korea right now over this. So I have my doubts about how helpful South Korea would be on anything. Second, simply getting in there to grab that family it'd be the stuff of a great movie. And then I would love to see us adapt the plot, but hard to do. Our military has contingencies for, especially right now with this coronavirus, where they're worried about what might happen. Could something suddenly slip? For trying to immediately move in to control the arsenal. That's vital, because you don't want somebody saying, hey, I think I'll sell this to a terrorist while we're sorting things out here. If the government collapses, it would be very important. Also, China would try to come in. I mean, sort of a strange 21st century version of what happened in Eastern Europe in World War II. So probably not. On the other hand, was I hoping that while Kim Jong-un was at those summits in Singapore and Hanoi, he would just sort of get stuck in the closet? Crossed my mind. What would they do? Again, North Korea plays chicken. And the question is, at what point can we play chicken with enough confidence and reserve to win? Which would be a great message, by the way, to send to China, to Iran, to all these other rogues of that sort of axis of evil.
Well, I agree. I have another question for you, and I want to just tell our audience again, you can send questions through GoToWebinar or text me at fleitz@centerforsecuritypolicy.org. Our next question is, do you believe our intelligence community, or no, why is it our intelligence community knows so little about what's going on in the North Korean government?
Because I'm sorry to say this, because I've never, I'm not an insider in the intelligence community. I'm one of the people who badger people to tell me things, and they don't. But I think because we've been really rather bad at it. There are a few standout exceptions. I would look at the work of, say, what I was citing before, Bob Collins, who publishes things. This is open source. As a much better source than a lot of the hints we've seen of actual intelligence. Now, I have to hope there's some layer in there I don't know about that's much better. But if I could give you an example of how bad it apparently has been going back, this goes back 11 years. I hope it's improved. You might remember that right after President Obama came in, there was a Fox News reporter who got some classified information from a State Department desk employee and published a story in which he mentioned it. And the information he had was that according to this classified report, North Korea was about to touch off another nuclear test. There was a very high possibility that that's how they would respond to sanctions. Okay. And that was enough to send the State Department officer to prison here. Okay, well, the actual intelligence was just stupid. It was terrible. As it turned out, there's this classified report which said, oh, expect another nuclear test anytime if you impose sanctions. They imposed sanctions. It was 4 more years before North Korea conducted another nuclear test. I mean, I could have done a better job from my desk. So if that's the standard, and I do think we have people who are much better, okay, I think that we have little window on that because more than almost any place in the world, except maybe China, for somebody to be suspected of being a spy for the Americans in North Korea would be an instant death sentence. I mean, that would be over. They watch everything. So you would want to protect assets incredibly carefully. That said, could I just throw in something I always hope? And again, I'm not of the intelligence community. I mean, I've been stupid enough to make my career as a journalist, but I do think that there's all sorts of opportunity there for us to feed back disinformation to North Korea. And I profoundly hope we're doing that. In fact, one of the things I periodically say, if I were plotting a novel about this, since I would not personally prescribe that we do anything dishonest as a matter of public policy, but if I were plotting the novel, one of Kim Jong-un's biggest problems is knowing whom to trust around him. That's why he keeps executing them. You know, who do you trust? That's the problem of the tyrant. And go for undermining that. One way you could do it is leak to the ever credulous press news of bank accounts held by close officials to Kim Jong-un, offshore bank accounts. In fact, America has every ability to create those. Now, how you do that, I leave that to the intelligence community or the administration. But anything that helps to undermine Kim Jong-un's trust in people around him would be good. Are we able to do that legally? I don't know. You know, how far can we go? Tough call. But our intelligence, let me take it back to the simplest thing. If our intelligence community knew whether he was dead or alive recently, they didn't tell us much about it. Either they didn't know or we just don't know. We don't have any idea what they actually know.
I have a question about South Korea and the Moon government. And how exactly does President Moon see the threat from North Korea? And how does his approach differ from President Trump's approach?
President Moon seems to come from the school that thinks all you need to do is understand them and appreciate them and reach out to them and it will all be well. And that's disastrous with North Korea. The more you give them, the more they will take. You know, something that I would also keep in mind, we are not in 1950, okay? The world has moved on greatly. And at the same time, there was a lesson that year that is worth just keeping in mind. John Foster Dulles, then Secretary of State, made a visit to the DMZ. He went to South Korea, which had been, the peninsula had been divided at the end of World War II. There was all sorts of debate over how it was all going to go. He went and he took a look and he came back and he spoke to the parliament in Seoul, such as it then was. And he said, this was picked up in the US press was reporting, all peaceful, everything looks fine. And less than a week later, North Korea rolled over the DMZ with a surprise invasion and we got the Korean War. And I think Americans, we have a short memory here, a short news cycle. The Korean War was a long time ago, except for people who actually fought in it or their families. And thank you if you did. But that's the legacy, that's the history that Kim Jong-un descends from. And that's the uncompleted task. And there has been great deterrence to that because America has kept military forces in South Korea. They know that they would not readily get away with something like that. It would probably be the end of North Korea. At the same time, as the world becomes more distracted, as challenges arise in other places, watch out for, if not a direct military invasion, some equivalent. And President Moon in South Korea has done really nothing to arm against that. President Trump, on the other hand, I think understands what the problem is with North Korea. I think he
Well,
understands that this
Moon has actually lowered defenses, right, over the
correct.
last years.
Yeah, yeah. So you have it's a difficult play. He was elected just as President Trump had come into office. So you went from a government, an administration in South Korea that wanted to take a tough line with North Korea, and while President Obama undercut that at every turn with his strategic patience.
I want to fit in a couple more questions if I can. Now, I don't have the name of everybody who's asking these. I have a question here. Will North Korea be a top issue for the US presidential election? But I want to add something else to that. And that is, I'm wondering if you might want to speculate, who do you think Kim wants to win the 2020 presidential election, Trump or his Democratic opponent?
My bet would be that while he enjoys the letters from President Trump, he would do so much better with a Democratic opponent, because that way the path would probably be open again to a shakedown nuclear negotiation. I would expect a nuclear test, some ballistic missile tests, and then the usual stories that North Korea might now be open to talks. And unlike President Trump, who has not given them the fat prize they wanted, I think you'd see a resumption of the fat prize to keep them quiet, appeasement, which has been so dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's right. Final question. There have been many experts who've speculated that the North Koreans are experimenting with EMP weapons, electromagnetic pulse weapons, that they would use their nuclear arsenal to attack the US electric grid and other nations. I don't know if you're an expert on this, but I have a couple questions about it. So I thought I would ask you what your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. And to me, the part that needs expertise is exactly how effective these would be, how much damage, how much accuracy you need. And for that, you do want an expert. The part that I think I can comment on with some understanding is, if there is, with sort of readily damage to be done, I would assume that they are working on that. And, you know, it's certainly consistent with the missile launches they've done, with the tests they've done. I would assume that they're working on everything. And I would actually worry also, allow me to cheer up your day. Okay. I would worry also about things like their bioweapons program, where the lockdown that they have right now, for all that they may have coronavirus cases, is also a great dry run for how you deal with blowback from a bioweapons program. They've seen, like China, like everybody who is hostile to the US, they've seen how we react. So needs more expertise on the EMP question, but they work on everything. Remember, cyber, both EMP, which would be basically nuclear on a missile, cyber, bio, chemical. This is the reason. The only real answer is that regime has to go.
Well, Claudia Rosett, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion on North Korea. And I'd like to thank our viewers for tuning in today for this discussion. This is a crucial national security issue that isn't getting enough attention right now. And we're going to post this video on our website. We'll be sending it to Trump administration officials. We'll be writing it up, and the center's trying to do its part in trying to keep our nation safe. So, and we appreciate all of your support for this effort. As I said earlier, we're having weekly webinars during this lockdown every Wednesday at 1 p.m. We're planning on having one of these next Wednesday that Frank Gaffney will chair with a special guest. We have to see if we get this guest. I think it's going to be 1 p.m., but just keep watching our website. We'll send you an email to remind you of the time. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much and look forward to seeing you again.